One day, federal agents came to arrest Carlo Gambino, one of the most feared men in America. He invited them in for coffee. Not a joke, not a movie scene. Coffee. Dessert, too, according to later accounts. As if this were not an arrest at all, just an inconvenient social call. And that is the first thing you have to understand about Carlo Gambino. He did not behave like a man being hunted. He behaved like a man who had already accepted that the state would eventually knock on his door, and that when it did, it would still be entering his house on his terms. That kind of calm is strange, almost absurd. But with Gambino, it was also deeply unsettling. Because by then, the quiet old man, offering hospitality, was not some neighborhood grandfather. He was, according to law enforcement, the head of the largest and most powerful Mafia family in the United States. Carlo Gambino looked wrong for the role. He was small, soft-spoken, almost courtly. He had a sharp, beak-like nose, a puckish face, and the kind of expression that could make him look like a kindly uncle at a family wedding. He did not swagger. He did not chase publicity. He did not dress like a peacock or talk like a movie gangster. That was part of the trick. Other mob bosses announced themselves. Carlo Gambino erased himself, but police knew the name. Federal officials knew the name. Immigration courts knew the name. Senate investigators knew the name. And in whispered rooms across New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Florida, and beyond, gangsters knew the name too. He was not loud. He was not theatrical. He was worse. He was patient. Carlo Gambino was born in Sicily in the first years of the 20th century, in a world where the Mafia was not a myth or a newspaper headline. It was part of the weather, part of the soil. In some neighborhoods, the state existed only in theory. Real authority came through family, reputation, violence, and silence. If you wanted protection, you did not call a government office. You called a man, and if that man solved your problem, you owed him. That kind of environment does something to a child. It teaches a very simple lesson early. Law is negotiable, power is personal, and survival belongs to those who understand the difference between what is said in public and what is decided in private. By the time Gambino came to America, he was not arriving with some innocent dream of reinvention. He was arriving with a language of power already installed. He slipped into the United States as a stowaway, hidden aboard a ship, landing on the East Coast before making his way to Brooklyn. Decades later, an appellate court would describe the moment in cold legal language. His original entry into the United States as a stowaway was illegal then and illegal now. That line matters because it tells you something almost too perfect about Carlo Gambino. He entered America the same way he would move through it for the rest of his life, quietly, unlawfully, and without asking permission. Brooklyn was not a clean break from Sicily. It was an extension of it. Relatives were already there. So were cousins, uncles, trucking businesses, neighborhood loyalties, and criminal pathways hidden inside ordinary work. This was immigrant New York, crowded and suspicious, where respectable enterprise and underworld enterprise sometimes used the same storefront, the same relatives, the same dinner table. The line between labor and racketeering, between transport and theft, between family business and organized crime could be very thin. Gambino stepped across that line early. His first truly meaningful recorded offense was not some glamorous gangland spectacle. It was smaller, uglier, and more revealing than that. He was eventually convicted in the 30s for running an illegal liquor still, part of the old underground machinery of vice and evasion that had made so many criminal careers during and after Prohibition. He served prison time for it, nearly 2 years. In a criminal life that stretched across more than half a century, that would be his only significant stretch behind bars. Think about that. A man whom authorities regarded as one of the central figures in American organized crime would do only that much time. That is not luck. That is a system being studied, tested, and outmaneuvered. By then, Gambino was already learning from the dead. New York's underworld in those years was violent, unstable, and crowded with ambitious men who mistook brutality for permanence. Bosses rose fast, then fell faster. Carlo Gambino attached himself, one after another, to powerful figures in the Mafia world. first to men connected to old Sicilian factions, then to Joe Masseria, then to Salvatore Maranzano, then into the family structure that emerged after the Castellamarese War reshaped the American underworld. And every time the map changed, Gambino survived. That survival is the point. He was not the loudest man in the room. He was the man who left the room alive and slightly closer to power than when he entered it. He watched how bosses were betrayed. He watched how alliances shifted. He watched how ambition attracted bullets. And from all of that, Carlo Gambino built a style that would make him unusually dangerous. He would not dominate through spectacle. He would dominate through restraint. That restraint carried him into the orbit of Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared killers in organized crime. Anastasia was the opposite of Gambino in all the ways that mattered. Violent, hot-blooded, unpredictable. The kind of man who made enemies simply by continuing to breathe. Gambino became his underboss, which sounds subordinate, but in Mafia history it can also mean something else. It can mean that the quiet man has been allowed to stand directly behind the throne and take measurements. Then came the barber chair. Late in the 50s, Albert Anastasia walked into the barber shop of a Manhattan hotel and settled in for a shave. It was supposed to be routine. A little grooming, a little vanity, a little peace. Instead, gunmen entered and opened fire. Anastasia, one of the most feared mob bosses in America, died in front of the mirror, covered in blood and broken glass, reportedly lurching at his own reflection in the chaos. It remains one of the most iconic murders in Mafia history, and according to law enforcement and later informant accounts, Carlo Gambino was one of the men behind it. One witness to the era, mob turncoat Joseph Valachi, later put it bluntly. Without Vito backing him, Carlo never would have gone for it. But with support in the right places, and with Anastasia increasingly seen as unstable and abusive, the impossible suddenly became practical. The king was killed. The quiet underboss inherited the kingdom. That was the moment Carlo Gambino stopped being just another underworld survivor and became something colder. A strategist who understood that the cleanest way to seize power was to let bigger personalities create the justification for their own removal. And yet, even then, he did not rush to become famous. That is what made him so effective. A few weeks after Anastasia's murder, Mafia leaders gathered in upstate New York at the infamous Appalachian meeting, a summit that ended in police scrutiny and public embarrassment. Gambino attended. Authorities noticed. The country noticed. Suddenly, the old fiction that national organized crime did not really exist became harder to maintain. For some gangsters, that kind of exposure was poison. For Carlo Gambino, it was data. He learned what too much visibility cost. He saw what happened when powerful men started believing their own mythology, and from that point on, his method sharpened. Live modestly. Speak softly. Avoid headlines. Build influence where cameras do not go. Waterfront unions, trucking, construction, garment district businesses, airport cargo, labor relations, gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, quiet control over places where money moved and men could be pressured. He expanded not like a street thug, but like a patient executive with access to violence. By now, this was no longer random criminal behavior. It was a pattern. Police understood it. Federal officials understood it. Even when they could not fully prove the architecture, they could see the shape. A soft-spoken immigrant, who seemed to live like a moderately successful businessman, was repeatedly appearing at the center of investigations involving rackets, labor corruption, and underworld governance. The same name kept surfacing. The same old face. The same polite denials. Officials described him as the preeminent figure in organized crime in the country. They believed he exerted influence not just over his own family, but over the wider Mafia commission that set policy for families across the nation. And still, he kept the performance going. No mansion with gold-plated nonsense. No celebrity friendships splashed across newspapers. No theatrical speeches. He lived in a comfortable apartment in Brooklyn and a modest home on Long Island. He looked by design, like a man you would underestimate. That understatement shaped his private life too. Carlo Gambino married Catherine Castellano, his cousin, binding family even tighter to business. In ordinary households, marriage is supposed to widen the world. In Gambino's world, it narrowed it. Blood relations became business partners. Brothers-in-law became allies. Children became extensions of strategy. Later, one of Gambino's sons would marry into the Lucchese family. The family table was not separate from the organization. It was part of it, and that had consequences. Because when your power is built on silence, your family learns to live inside silence too. They learn which questions are never asked. They learn how to endure surveillance cars parked outside. They learn that public shame can arrive without warning, and that strangers may know your surname before they know your face. For all the mythology about old-world honor, there was something claustrophobic about it. Carlo Gambino was said to prefer the company of relatives over politicians or entertainers courted by other bosses. That sounds loyal. It also sounds like a man who kept his world tightly sealed, because trust, to him, was never abstract. It was blood, or it was temporary, and even blood was not safe. In the early 70s, Gambino's nephew, Manny, was kidnapped and murdered by an Irish gang crew that had been targeting Italian mob figures for ransom. That killing cut close. Suddenly, the system of fear Gambino had spent decades mastering reached into his own family circle. The response was swift and merciless. He wanted vengeance, and younger men in the family, including a rising gangster named John Gotti, helped deliver it. That moment matters because it shows the collision clearly. This was not just business anymore, if it ever had been. This was family grief processed through criminal power. No court, no public mourning with clean hands, just retaliation. By then, Gambino was older, richer, and more entrenched than almost any underworld boss before him. But the state had not stopped trying. Immigration authorities pursued him for the illegal entry that began his American life. The government moved to deport him. Courts upheld the order. Prosecutors tried to question him about his business activities, his income, his associates. He refused. Hearings were delayed because of his health. Officials acknowledged that he suffered from serious heart problems. At one point, even questioning had to be adjusted for fear that standard interrogation might endanger him. There is something grimly ironic about that. The state, which believed this man had spent decades feeding off coercion and criminal enterprise, now found itself handling him delicately because his heart might fail. And maybe it would. That was the maddening part. His illnesses appear to have been real. Heart attacks interrupted prosecutions. Hospitalizations delayed consequences. A hijacking case never properly came to trial because of his condition. Deportation stalled. Time kept doing for Carlo Gambino what lawyers and enforcers had done for him before. Buying distance. This is where his story shifts from chaos to tragedy, or at least to something close to it. He did not collapse in some operatic hail of bullets. He did not rant from a witness stand. He did not flee into exile like a ruined king. Instead, he diminished. The body that had protected him by surviving now protected him by failing. Each heart seizure turned him, in public, into something almost pitiful, a frail old man pursued by the government. But underneath that image was the same difficult truth. The system knew who he was. It had watched him for years. It had labeled him, investigated him, indicted him, followed him, and still, it had never truly broken the machine around him. That is the system failure at the center of Carlo Gambino's life. He was not unknown. He was not hidden in some cave. His name appeared in court records. His presence at Appalachian was notorious. His influence over labor rackets and organized crime was widely alleged by authorities, and yet during more than 50 years in crime, he served only about 22 months in prison. Punishment existed, correction did not. The law could harass him, delay him, embarrass him, even nearly deport him. But it could not remake the world that produced him, and it could not fully penetrate the family structures, codes of silence, economic corruption, and institutional fear that kept men like him powerful. In that sense, Carlo Gambino was not merely a criminal. He was proof of a larger malfunction. Then came the final act, and it was so ordinary, it almost feels disrespectful to history. He died at home on Long Island of natural causes after years of heart trouble. No gunshots, no courtroom collapse, no dramatic manhunt, just an old man in a house, ending quietly after a life built around the management of violence. He was mourned by family. A wake was held in Brooklyn. A funeral mass followed. And even in death, he left a problem behind. Instead of passing power cleanly to his underboss, Neil Della Croce, Gambino chose his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, as successor. It was a blood decision and a business decision, exactly the kind of choice Carlo Gambino had been making his whole life. But it planted the seeds of future instability, resentment, and eventually more bloodshed. Even his exit did not close the system. It merely handed the tension forward. So what was Carlo Gambino really? A monster in a cardigan. A disciplined strategist, shaped by Sicily and perfected by New York. A family man whose idea of family was inseparable from coercion. A criminal genius, if by genius you mean the ability to understand institutions well enough to survive inside their blind spots. A quiet old uncle who, according to the state, sat near the top of a national criminal order and somehow managed to look harmless almost to the end. He did not drink himself into oblivion. He did not rage in public. He did not self-destruct in the flamboyant way many gangsters do. His cycle was subtler than that. It was repetition without spectacle, invisibility as method, calm as camouflage. Each year, another investigation, another delay, another accommodation, another funeral for someone else. And maybe that is why Carlo Gambino still feels so unnerving. He forces a harder question than the usual gangster cliches. Was he simply a product of the world that made him? A boy born into a system where power had always worn a private face and silence was the first law? Or was he something colder than that? A man who saw every off-ramp, every warning, every corpse, every courtroom, and chose the life anyway because he was extraordinarily good at it. Maybe the most disturbing answer is that both things can be true. Because somewhere between the stowaway on the ship and the old man offering coffee to federal agents, Carlo Gambino became more than a criminal biography. He became a lesson in how evil can look tidy, how power can whisper, how a man can spend a lifetime near violence without appearing violent at all. And if that is true, then the most haunting thing about Carlo Gambino is not how he lived, it is how normal he could make it seem.